Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm glad to have you back again. We're going to be talking today about the Enlightenment and Emancipation. Last time we talked about Kabbalah, Hasidism, and in some ways, sort of the transition from the medieval world to the modern world. And in particular, this transition is really exemplified by the intellectual transformation that we today call the Enlightenment. But I did want to show you at the start a kind of humorous goodbye to the Middle Ages. This is a classic clip from the show Saturday Night Live. If you haven't seen it, you'll enjoy it. If you have, you'll probably still enjoy it. But this is, again, an opening to that transition from the medieval world of tradition is always true to the possibility of a modern world where evidence and reason might, in fact, have better answers for the problems of life. So a classic example of the mockery of the Middle Ages as backwards and the opening of new opportunities by asking new questions and by looking for new answers that we think of today as emblematic of the Enlightenment. Now, one of the challenges in talking about our topic today is that it's both Enlightenment and Emancipation. Now, sometimes it depends which happens first. That is, in some cases, Jewish people and Jewish populations were emancipated. They were given their citizenship, the right to vote, the right for permanent residence, the right of individual participation in the society rather than the collective rights they had in the Middle Ages before they really had evolved in an intellectual sense. In other cases, the Enlightenment, with this idea of its modernization, openness to new ideas and so on, began to affect the Jewish population long before they had the opportunity to become part of the surrounding society. In some cases, they used their ongoing enlightenment as an argument to say we're justified. In fact, we deserve emancipation. And in some cases, the society surrounding them was so unwilling to welcome them in that the Enlightenment cause was hurt. It was harder to sell people on enlightening because the prospects for ultimate emancipation were so far away. So the point is that they are really an interrelated process, that the Enlightenment is happening in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries at the same time that the gradual process of Jewish citizenship and emancipation is taking place. And obviously, they're having interactions one with the other. So if you were living in Western Europe, in France, for example, or in England, where by the end of the 19th century, Jews are fully emancipated as citizens of the French state, or as English citizens as well. And I mean fully emancipated to the point of even being able to serve in public office. As we'll see, emancipation is sort of a long process. It's not all or nothing, because there are times you could vote, let's say, but not necessarily serve in office, because the oath of office required your affirmation as a Christian, or even as a Protestant Christian. You may not realize that Catholics in England weren't fully emancipated until a certain stage in the process of English democracy, because they had to swear on a Protestant Bible, which the Catholics wouldn't be willing to do. So Jews also are part of this process of emancipation. But that's a prospect in Western Europe and in America, which is sort of an extension of Western European culture. In Central Europe, in Germany, Hungary, and in Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, largely, and the Polish Empire in between World War I and World War II, Jews have a much harder row to hoe when it comes to hoping for emancipation. They're ultimately never emancipated by the czars. It's the Bolshevik Revolution that gives Jews their citizenship in Eastern Europe, and World War I's resulting Poland also gave Jews citizenship as well. But before that point, before the 19-teens, the emancipation argument was being beating your head against a brick wall. They weren't getting anywhere because the czars were barely interested in emancipating the serfs. They had no interest in a representative democracy or anything that might undermine their full autocratic powers. We forget, by the way, the word czar in Russian is their version of Caesar. It's like dictator. So that's what they wanted to be. They did not want democracy, and they certainly didn't want Jews becoming part of that citizenry that they didn't want anyways. So it was a much harder setting to make the argument that if we just enlighten ourselves, our neighbors will see us worthy of citizenship. Where in Germany, that was more of an easier sell, and ultimately by the 1870s, the Jews are emancipated there after several decades of self-enlightenment in preparation for that emancipation. But you can see how the two details interact with each other directly. So let's look first at Enlightenment, and then we'll talk a little bit more about emancipation. And we have to look first at the non-Jewish Enlightenment world before we talk about the Jewish Enlightenment, which is sometimes called the Haskalah. So what are some of the basic principles of the European Enlightenment? And I will preface this by saying in the last decade or two, there have been some very interesting critiques of Enlightenment as being a particularly European, even a colonialist serving intellectual project. That is, in some ways, the ideas of this abstract reason and universal inheritance of rationality were being deployed in Europe at the same time that they are colonizing India and North Africa and the rest of Africa and other parts of the world. So one has to ask, were these Enlightenment principles applied to every human being as they said they were, or were they applied to every white human being, or every European human being, or every male human being? Because, of course, the Enlightenment had a big blind spot when it came to women, too. So this is where we have to temper some of the absolute endorsement of the Enlightenment that maybe previous generations of humanists might have offered, with some awareness of the cultural context for its promulgation and development. So with that caveat in mind, the basic concept of Enlightenment is a focus on human knowledge. Immanuel Kant was once asked to define what is enlightenment. The word in German is Aufklärung. You can hear the word clear in there. But Kant put it into a very short Latin phrase, which was translated as dare to know. Not just that you can know, but have the courage to know, to explore, to discover, and then to say it out loud and write it down and transmit that knowledge. Now, the Enlightenment didn't spring out of nowhere. The Renaissance, a couple centuries earlier, had opened the doors to Hellenistic philosophy, Greek art, and the representation of the human form. The Protestant Reformation, some centuries after that, had broken the Catholic monopoly on both religious ideas and also on the concept of knowledge, that the priests weren't the only ones who could learn, because Luther emphasized returning to the Bible. He wanted increased literacy. He translated the Bible into German, so you didn't have to know Latin. You could just use the language you spoke every day in German territories and read the Holy Writ. And so this leads to an increased literacy. Of course, once you can read the Bible, you can read other things too. And so we get the birth of newspapers and broadsheets and popular literature, literature the church would have condemned, philosophy, and among a much broader part of the population than the scholastic tradition of the 1200s, 1300s of the later Middle Ages. And you even get this phenomenon that's sometimes called the Protestant work ethic, as described by Max Weber and others, where Protestants felt like they shouldn't overindulge in material excess during this life because it might lead them astray or be even a sign that they weren't chosen for ultimate reward in heaven. And so what happens is they worked hard and they saved money and they wound up with a lot of capital around. And this will lead to the rise of capitalism in the 19th century, which we'll talk about in a future class. So in any case, the essence of Enlightenment as dare to know had a number of radical ideas at its basis. One of them, which we saw previewed in that video, is that rational human thought can do better than inherited tradition. So if an ancient Greek medical thinker, I think it was Galen, came up with the idea of the 4 bodily humors, well, let's see what's really in there. And you get the beginning of anatomy study and experimental science, as opposed to just reaffirming the traditions of the old world. And so this ultimately leads to the kind of medicine we enjoy today. There was a long process to get there, and a lot of people died along the way. And to be honest, a lot of corpses were stolen from cemeteries because that's how people got anatomy subjects to study. They became grave robbers as medical students. But in any case, the concept was that human thought can do better than inherited tradition. And this scientific method of careful observation and experiments that you test and repeat and understand the mechanism behind, that could really describe the world and fix human problems better than the past. Now you can see how that kind of ideology will be corrosive of religious tradition and corrosive of political tradition. Because if it's not good just because it's old, it has to have an argument, a reason, be more effective than the new thing I came up with. Well, unfortunately, ancestral inherited monarchies don't work so well. Meritocracies might do better. And the same thing with medical science, with studies of the economy and engineering, mechanical functioning, and so on. Now, out of that approach to practical problem solving also came a philosophical conclusion. And this is the concept that what makes human beings special is not their birth, it's their rational mind. And all human beings potentially have this fully rational mind. Again, male, white, we understand the caveats there. It was called the tabula rasa, the blank slate. You have to realize how radical the pronouncement of the blank slate was, because before, pedigree was more important. You were born as a serf, you would live as a serf, you would die as a serf. And maybe a few people managed to make it from the serfs to the bourgeoisie, but they almost never made it from the bourgeoisie to the royalty, to the nobility, to the aristocracy. That was privilege by birth. And of course, the monarchy was only by birth. Well, if that's the case, then this whole concept of individual rights or the value of the rational mind, who cares? It's all by birth. But now the Enlightenment is flipping that on its head by saying that what makes human beings special is not their pedigree, it's their rational mind that all have in potential. And therefore, as human beings, since everybody theoretically has the same abilities, then everybody theoretically should have the same protections. What today we call rights. The same abilities to live their life, the same legal obligations that society is bound to protect for everybody, because they all are potentially contributors to society based on that rational mind. Now we know, of course, human beings are also unique in their emotionality, in their irrationality, in their violence and tribalism. We're one of the only species that commits genocide on its own species. There are some bands of chimpanzees that have done it, who are our close cousins, but otherwise it very rarely happens at the scale that human beings are able to kill each other. So yay us, who are unique in the animal kingdom. Anyways, with that, again, another caveat aside, we understand that once you say noble birth is no privilege, then individuals have rights, and those rights are bound to be protected in some kind of governmental system. So now you see how this concept of rational human thought is better than tradition leads to what we value, things like human rights, democracy, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. They're all part and parcel of that Enlightenment project. And there are a number of major thinkers that contribute to the European Enlightenment. There's John Locke in England, for example, in his letter on toleration, points out that there's something sovereign of the individual human being. It's their free individual mind. And a society is stupid to try to restrict that individual mind, because nobody can make you think anything. And Locke is actually basing this idea on some of Spinoza's writing, who says similar things. I can't make you think that 2 + 2 = 5. I can make you say that, but I can't get in your brain and poke buttons and make you think it. So compelling thought is a fool's errand, and in fact encourages people to learn how to lie. And that's not good for society. So the toleration of different ideas becomes important. Of course, again, an heir to the Protestant Reformation, where England went through civil war after civil war of religion, and finally they came up with a new idea. Instead of trying to impose my religion, let's try and tolerate each other's opinions as agree to disagree. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is another famous figure in France who comes up with the idea of the social contract, that people live in a state of nature where they have these individual rights, and they come together to create society by signing away some of their freedoms in exchange for some protections. So you have sort of 3 categories here. You've got, what am I free to do? What am I protected from other people doing to me? And my rights are somewhere in between those. It's the balance of what I'm free to do, but I might affect someone else, so then they might stop me because that's infringing on their rights. So we have that collateral, or as one person put it, my freedom ends where my fist hits your nose. That's the definition of rights. And then, of course, there were the encyclopedists, most famously Diderot, who are tasked with the mission of collecting all of human knowledge. Again, if rational thought, if human beings can discover real things about the world, then we should find out as much as we can about those people. In fact, when the French Revolution tried to impose a new calendar on the world, by the way, they tried to make it decimal-based calendar, so you had 9 work days before 1 day off. It was a flop because nobody wanted to shift to that schedule. But they actually created a calendar with secular saints assigned for every day, but they were saints of science and progress and human discovery and human knowledge. Those were the heroes to be celebrated throughout the French Revolutionary calendar. Now, what begins to happen as this European Enlightenment begins to take off early to middle 1700s, it begins to influence Jewish life by the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. So it takes about 30, 50 years for it to begin to percolate into Jewish circles. And the most famous figure identified with this early stage of Haskalah in Western and Central Europe is a man named Moses Mendelssohn. Now, Moses Mendelssohn lives in Poland. He moves to Germany. So he actually begins his life speaking Yiddish, receives a traditional Jewish religious education, but he also begins to learn German and ultimately Latin and other European languages. He manages to move to Berlin with the agreement of a sponsor. In fact, at the time, Jews living in Berlin had a strict numerical limit. You had to get explicit permission to be able to move to Berlin if you were Jewish, which he was able to do. He lives from 1729 to 1786, so through the heart of the 1700s. And his example of combining rabbinical study and knowledge and traditional Jewish practice on the one hand, with a deep knowledge of European languages, culture, and ideas on the other, proves to be revolutionary for the Jewish community, and for that matter, for the non-Jewish community. At one point, Mendelssohn enters an essay contest and wins, beating Immanuel Kant in a philosophical essay contest. And there's a famous anecdote where Mendelssohn went to visit Kant in his classroom, and in his university classroom, and he's beginning to get jeered by the students who recognize that he's Jewish, until Kant comes in and embraces him as a great friend. And the students are amazed. Who is this Jewish person that Kant likes so much? Because how could a Jew have anything to contribute to a university classroom? But Mendelssohn is able to do it. He's a fixture of what's called the salon culture, where rich people would get famous intellectuals and writers to come over for dinner and have witty conversation. And that was the entertainment of the day, long before Zoom classes were available. So what are some of Mendelssohn's key ideas here? The first one is that the state should only use its force for the common good or for the protection of the people. And when it comes to religion, there are many religions that can train you how to be a good person. It's not only Protestant Christianity that can do so. And therefore, traditional Jewish life, religious practice, and ritual is not a barrier to full citizenship, because full citizenship is premised on being an ethical person who contributes to society, and Jews can do that. And he even goes through trying to explain how what looks like odd rituals of dietary laws or circumcision or putting a mezuzah on the doorpost are actually ethical training devices that are training the Jews to be good people. And you don't have to do them to be a good person. You can find your ethics from philosophy or from Protestant Christianity, but you can also find them through the Jewish ritual of seeing the mezuzah on the doorpost, reminding you of God's sovereignty and the need to follow divine rules. So it's just a constant reminder to be a good person. He knows if you are sleeping. He knows if you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. Now, another premise of Mendelssohn's philosophy is that religion and reason are going to come to the same conclusions. They just come from different directions. So you can study the revealed text of Judaism and you can get to wonderful philosophical conclusions, or you can study the natural world, what's called natural theology, and you'll come to profound and solid philosophical conclusions. So there's nothing that you'll find in traditional Jewish sources that is in any way a conflict with reason and the ideas of the Enlightenment. Now, today we might call that apologetics, where you're trying to prove that what you already believe actually makes sense, but you already believe it and you're not going to change it no matter what. So Mendelssohn's work was somewhat effective in his generation, but somewhat problematic in later generations who didn't feel as compelled as he did to continue following a traditional Jewish life, because he was committed to living a modern life with modern languages, but also maintaining traditional Jewish dietary practice, ritual practice, separation, and so on. So the fact that many of his children and grandchildren ultimately converted to Christianity is seen by the traditionalist as a failure, as the fact that his opening the door became the camel's nose in the tent of modernity that then let in the feared conversion out of Judaism into European culture. One famous example of this is a German living in the early 19th century named Heinrich Heine, who's a wonderful poet, but who converts to Christianity, even though he says somewhat caustically, I don't believe in Christianity any more than I didn't believe in Judaism. Like, I don't believe in either one of them. But this conversion is my passport to European culture. Once I'm officially not Jewish, I can be part of the European world, and people will read my poetry. Same thing happened to Gustav Mahler, who was a composer but could not get a job because most of the jobs were in churches, and so he converted as well. Even some of the founders of the earliest schools of academic Jewish studies wound up converting to Christianity because they wanted a university position, and Jews could not be hired with their PhDs in university positions. So in the end, for some people, the Enlightenment model of Mendelssohn was unsustainable because of the legal disabilities that Jews faced if they maintained their Judaism. Now, there were some others who were motivated by Mendelssohn's example to find a more middle ground. It's not a coincidence that in the generation after Mendelssohn, if Mendelssohn dies in 1786, the generation after is coming of age in the 1810s, 18-teens. That's when you begin to see the first examples of what today we call Reform Judaism or religious reform, where they begin to say, well, we want to maintain Jewishness. We don't want to convert because reform is an alternative to converting out. We want to maintain our Jewishness, but maybe some things do need to change in our religious practice and even in some of our beliefs. And so they begin to celebrate a coming of age ceremony for both boys and girls, not just a bar mitzvah for boys. Now there's a confirmation modeled on the Lutheran Church for both boys and girls. They have mixed seating, so men and women don't need to be segregated. You can sit with your family, like a family pew you might see in a church. They bring a pipe organ into religious services because that's what modern science and technology would prove has elevated the human spirit in prayer. They begin to offer sermons in the vernacular language in German. They might even begin to translate the prayers into German so you understand what you're saying instead of simply reciting Hebrew, you don't know what it means. And they even begin to edit the prayer book to take out some ideas they might not believe in anymore. After all, if they want to be emancipated and become citizens of Germany, then praying for a return to Israel and a rebuilding of the state there might not make them look like very good citizens of Germany. And so maybe that prayer might be gently, quietly edited out. Plus, it makes the service a little bit shorter. And maybe that's an objective too. And maybe we want people to sit in pews and not stand up and sit down and stand up and sit down and talk all different times, as you'll see even today in an Orthodox synagogue where people are running at their own pace. Let's have everyone sing at the same time and maybe even have a choir sing with women's voices and maybe even hire non-Jewish singers to sing in our choirs. Now you can see that in some ways the reform impulse is radical. It's making great changes in Jewish tradition, but also notice it's conventional because it wants to be like everybody else. So it's at the same moment a radical and a conservative, or a breaking the mold and a fitting into the mold motivation. I want to be like my neighbors, which means I got to change my Jewishness. Well, one of the other factors in this, of course, is there's a non-Jewish population watching what the Jews are doing. And there were some thinkers of the Enlightenment who were in favor of Jewish enlightenment and Jewish emancipation. They said some of the problems the Jews have are our fault. Remember the tabula rasa? Everyone has a potentially rational mind and could be a good person, but look what we do to the Jews. We oppress them, we put them in ghettos, we don't allow them to work in any profession. Well, maybe we are contributing to their evil. You see, these enlighteners were still had imbibed the anti-Jewish sentiments of their society. And in some case, their argument was, let's emancipate the Jews so they'll become civilized, and then they'll see the light and convert to Christianity. So it was not a let's free the Jews for their own good. It was let's free the Jews because then they won't hate us for oppressing them, and they'll be able to listen to our ultimate truth of the world, which is the truth of Jesus. So Jews at the time would sort of take the first part, but not the second. They would have taken the Enlightenment, but said, thank you, no. to the conversion impulse. But there is an interesting phenomenon of Jewish converts to Christianity over the course of the 19th and 20th century. Sometimes they actually maintained a kind of crypto-Jewish community where they only married with other Jewish convert families. So they maintained a kind of crypto-Jewish identity even into the 19th and 20th centuries. And also there was this odd circumstance in Russia where Jewish converts often converted to Lutheranism or some kind of Protestantism rather than the Russian Orthodox Church, because that was a betrayal too far. You know, like you can root for the Cubs and you can root for the Baltimore Orioles, but you can't root for the Cubs and the White Sox. They're just too close. You can't pick two teams that are in direct conflict. So you go from Jewish to Lutheran, fine. Jewish to Russian Orthodox, that was betrayal. So again, the idea of conversion as a kind of acculturation is in the air at this time as well. But many Jews decide to find some middle ground of Haskalah, enlightenment, and change in Jewish life beyond what Mendelssohn contemplated as a middle ground, not to convert, but not to stay in the old world version either. And don't forget, the whole term Orthodox develops in the 19th century as a response to reform. It's saying the reformers have gone wrong and we are the ortho, the correct doctrine. They're wrong, we are right. You don't bother calling it Orthodox or Catholic until you have competition. They didn't call it the Catholic Church till there was the Protestant Reformation. So here we have, again, an example of the Orthodox responding to the reformers. The conservative movement is also responding to the reformers because they're not conservative compared to the Orthodox, but they're conservative compared to the reformers because the reformers, again, they say have gone too far. But they're the baseline against which the other movements are measuring themselves. And there's even a movement that begins also in Germany called Modern Orthodox, which is trying to really follow the model of Mendelssohn in maintaining the core principles of Jewish separatism, Jewish dietary laws, ritual practice, and so on. But maybe we can shave our beards. Maybe we can wear modern clothes. Maybe we should learn German and not only learn our separate languages. Maybe we can, be part of the surrounding culture up to a point. And you still see the modern Orthodox world today. They're the heirs of that model in the 19th century too. Now, ultimately, emancipation does not happen directly because of Jewish self-improvement, at least initially. There are two revolutions that lead to Jewish emancipation, one in North America and one in France. And the American emancipation was somewhat of a success, although it was kind of in fits and starts, because you remember there's two levels of government in America. You've got federal government and you've got state government. And while the federal government said there is no established church and there is no religious test for public office, that didn't necessarily apply to the states. So in certain states, Jews were not fully emancipated until several years after the adoption of the Constitution. There's one example in Maryland, they weren't fully emancipated in state government until 1826. So you're talking several decades after the adoption of the Constitution, where Maryland didn't allow Jews full emancipation. And again, in a few states, Catholics also took a little while to be fully emancipated. Now, a similar dialogue was taking place during the French Revolution, where the Jews were emancipated in pieces. First, the Jews of Paris proper, then the Jews of Bordeaux, and then the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine were emancipated in separate stages. And one of the debates that took place in the French National Assembly was, what does Jewish emancipation mean? Does it mean, for example, they can run their own government, live by their own laws, not participate in the surrounding culture? And so one of the phrases that came out in the debate in the assembly on the emancipation of the Jews was, to the Jews, everything is individuals, but nothing as a nation. That is, no collective rights, no national ethnic rights, but they could have individual rights. So individual Jews could become a citizen of France, but you couldn't necessarily have a community within a community with its own laws, as like a religious bubble, a ghetto, a shtetl. One of the famous lines that sort of dramatizes this dynamic is written some decades later by a poet in Eastern Europe who says that we should be a man on the street and a Jew in your tent. What that means is your Jewishness becomes a private matter. But when you're out in the public, you are a citizen like other citizens. So what we're going to do as our last sort of straight presentation, and make this a little bit more discussion oriented, is talk about a series of questions that Napoleon asked an assembly of Jewish notables. As I said, Jews were emancipated during the French Revolutionary period. By the time Napoleon takes over in 1799, they've had the vote, they've had citizenship, but there's still some questions outstanding about what does it mean to be a French citizen. And so Napoleon collects an assembly of notables, both rabbis and lay leaders, and he poses a series of questions to them that he thinks will clarify this dynamic of Jews versus state. So here we have some of the questions that he asked, not all of them. And as I read these questions, I want you to think about, why does Napoleon care about this issue? And what's the traditional Jewish answer? So first off, is it lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife? And the second one related to that, is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? Is divorce valid if not pronounced by the government's courts? Does it happen in contradiction to French laws? So let me ask you, what do you think is Napoleon's interest in asking if Jews can marry more than one wife, and if divorce is allowed both under Jewish religion and if not allowed by government courts? What do you think is going on there?
I think he's checking to see is there going to be conflict between you following the rules I and those in my government say? Is there going to be, are you not going to be following our social norms and our laws, or is it are you going to fit in at least in these ways, and it's not going to cause a huge conflict because you're going around with 7 wives in our society that strongly frowns upon that.
Okay, any other thoughts?
He may not want the Jewish population to grow more than the others.
Okay, so fertility might be another factor.
It's kind of what you were talking about too, Rabbi, with bubble within a bubble. They didn't want to make, they wanted to make sure that they were going to be following French law and not Jewish law.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. One equality under the law, one law for everybody.
Well, also you identify first as a French person and second as Jewish.
Okay.
So nationality, you're not Jewish, you're French.
Right. Right. We'll see more questions related to that as we go down a little further. Also, I think there's sort of an ick factor. How different are you than all of us? Because remember, France is primarily a Catholic country, except for the Huguenots who are Protestant, were expelled some centuries before. So it's a monogamous, one-wife country. And are you going to be like us, or are you going to be different than us? So, as much as there's acceptance of individual diversity, but there's not an acceptance of sort of multiculturalism as we might understand it today when it comes to these kind of questions of what is your domestic situation. In this case, the French government has a right, they think, to tell you how many wives you can marry. Now let's look at the next two in pair. Can a Jewish woman marry a Christian, or a Jewish man a Christian woman? Or is the Jewish law they can only marry amongst themselves? And in the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered as brothers or as strangers? So why does Napoleon care about that?
Well, he surely doesn't want people who aren't loyal to France in his midst. If you consider yourself a Frenchman, you're loyal to the state. If you don't, you're questionable.
Okay.
I think the issue of the religious issue is more of a Enlightenment. Are you going to be an insular community amongst yourselves and you don't interact, which intermarriage is a very distinct part. So do you cease being Jewish if you marry a Christian, and what are the kids raised? What's the primary identity here?
Mm-hmm. You remember the motto of the French Revolution? Liberté, égalité, liberty, equality, and fraternité, brotherhood, right? We're all one community. We're all one family. It's sort of the fictional family relationship of nationalism. The founding fathers and brothers in arms. Well, but if you won't marry me, or you won't let your daughter marry my son, then what kind of brotherhood do we have here? What kind of a national community is possible with self-segregation like this? So that's part of the dynamic that I think Napoleon is getting at here, wanting Jewishness to be more open. I realize we jumped on without looking at what the traditional Jewish answers were to some of these. So what is the traditional Jewish answer to marrying more than one wife and divorce? Are Jews allowed to marry more than one wife?
They were until the Middle Ages, when it became a problem with Christians around them, and they passed a 1,000-year ban in not in the Muslim areas, but in essentially most of Europe, that you could only have one wife. And then when it expired recently, they decided to keep going with it.
Right. So yes, in Europe, Jews did marry more than one wife, although you can certainly read in the Bible, at one time they did marry more than one wife, right? Plenty of examples in biblical stories. And divorce is also allowed by the Jewish religion. In this case, that's the right answer, because remember, one of the innovations of the French Revolution was allowing divorce, which the Catholic Church had prohibited. So they wanted the answer to be, yes, you can divorce, just like French laws. But notice, does it happen in contradiction to French laws? They want to make sure you have to qualify for the secular divorce, the government divorce, not just do it by religious law. Now, what's the traditional Jewish answer to marrying out of the faith? And do you consider the surrounders as your brother? I see a thumb down reaction there. Yeah, traditionally, you weren't allowed to marry out. You were supposed to only marry amongst yourselves. And were the outsiders brothers or strangers? Well, honestly, they were mostly considered strangers because they went to these buildings where there were all these statues that they bowed down and prayed to. So they were like idol worshipers, and those are about as bad as you can get in terms of foreign religion. Plus, they persecuted us for centuries and no love lost there. So yeah, I mean, traditionally, the answers to these would not have been the answers that Napoleon wanted to hear.
It's no different than my parents' generation. You weren't allowed to marry outside the religion.
Rabbi, you were saying that was a tradition. There's no, is there a Jewish law that says that? Certainly not in the Ten Commandments, but no.
Well, I mean, first of all, there's the rabbinic definition of who is Jewish as coming from the mother identity. So a man who married out could not produce Jewish children by rabbinic law. So that was sort of, anathema. I mean, you couldn't have a rabbi participate in it. You couldn't have a ketubah. You wouldn't get recognition from the community. You'd be shunned. So there absolutely was both legal basis and cultural practice of looking down on mixed marriages between communities. I mean, keep in mind that the outside world wasn't so interested in mixed marrying either. And usually when somebody married someone from another community, they joined that community. They went one way or the other. They didn't live with a foot in both worlds. There really wasn't a space to do that until the modern world. We'll see another example of that a little bit further down with this new concept called civil marriage. Because again, before civil marriage, where are they going to get married? People don't realize in The Fiddler on the Roof, the third daughter who gets married marries a Christian. And it's soft played in the movie. But in the stage play and in the original stories by Sholem Aleichem, it's very clear she got converted to Orthodox Christianity to get married because there was no justice of the peace. There's no city hall. You have to live. That's why in the movie version, he says, a bird might love a fish, but where are they going to live? But that was the world of religious life at this time, until you get a secular public square where they can maybe meet in the middle, or religious identity becomes a voluntary thing as opposed to a mandatory thing. That's why Spinoza, had to leave. He's sort of the first secular citizen because he leaves the Jewish community. He's kicked out, but he doesn't formally join the Christian community. He's sort of in this netherworld of secular living that is radically new at that time period. So through most of Jewish history, you had to either be Muslim or Christian or Jewish, and you had to settle in one. You couldn't live with a foot in both worlds.
That was the way it was until the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, there are examples of Jewish, non-Jewish intermarriage going back into the 19th century, but it was very tough, and it was very tough to find a space that they could live. And it was certainly tough to find either community that would accept it.
Rabbis wouldn't participate, and the congregations wouldn't.
Right. Although sometimes they didn't care what the rabbis thought. That is, they married out, and they married for love or for other reasons, and they didn't care. Okay, let's look at the next couple of questions. Do Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens consider France to be their country? Will they defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws? Well, I don't have to ask you why Napoleon cares about this, right? That they need to follow the laws here, and they need to treat France like their country if they're really citizens, and not feel like they're foreigners hoping to go back to a homeland somewhere else. They ask about police power the rabbis have, professions from which Jews are excluded by the law, and that old rumor, what about Jews taking heavy interest on loans at usurious rates? This is the Shylock, the moneylender, still being writ large in the 19th century, the age of enlightenment. So here are a couple of answers to these, and it's very interesting to watch the Assembly of Notables tap dance, because they know what Napoleon wants to hear, and they know what Jewish tradition says, and they need to satisfy both masters at the same time. So, first answer. It is not lawful for Jews to marry more than one wife. In all European countries, they must follow the general practice of marrying only one. Moses does not command directly to take many wives, but he does not forbid it. So they admit that there's a discontinuity there. Although this practice still happens in the Middle East, their ancient rabbis have told them to avoid taking more than one wife. And in the West, Rabbi Gershom in the 11th century enacted this curse against any Israelite who should take more than one wife. So easy answer. Yeah, we might have used to do it in the past. We might read about the Bible. We haven't done it for 1,000 years or 700 years. Don't worry about it. Okay, so easy answer, right? They can solve Napoleon's dilemma. They can answer traditionally. All set. Now we get number 3. Can a Jewish woman marry a Christian or a Jew or Christian woman? Answer. The law does not say that a Jewish woman cannot marry a Christian, nor a Jew or Christian woman, nor does it say that Jews can only marry among themselves. Excuse me? Let's see what they have to say about that, because they're saying that there's no barrier to intermarriage. Marriages of this kind are still found in France. We cannot deny that the opinion of the rabbis is against these marriages. How soft can you put it, right? Their opinion is against, like, they're not big fans. According to their beliefs, although the religion of Moses has not forbidden the Jews from intermarrying with nations not of their religion, marriage requires religious ceremonies called kiddushim, and no marriage can be religiously valid unless these ceremonies have been performed. This could not be done for people who would not both of them consider these ceremonies sacred. It's like a psychological rationale. If their heart wouldn't be in it, if it wouldn't be moving to them, then we can't do them. And it's like a technical out. But then notice the last part. And in that case, the married couple could separate without the religious divorce. They would be considered as married civilly, but not religiously. That's groundbreaking. Civilly, but not religiously. There's another category. So they could intermarry, they just have to do it at City Hall, but the rabbis won't do it. Such is the opinion of the rabbis. In general, they'd be no more willing to bless the union of a Jewish woman with a Christian, or a Jew with a Christian woman, than Catholic priests themselves would want to support unions of this kind. It's not just us. The Catholics don't like it either. So don't blame us if there's not going to be these marriages, because the priests wouldn't do it either. The rabbis acknowledge, however, again, radical statement at the end, that a Jew who marries a Christian woman does not stop being considered as a Jew by his brethren, any more than if he had married a Jewish woman civilly and not religiously. So A, there's an option the Jewish couple could ditch the rabbi entirely and just go to the courthouse. And B, there's an option that a Jewish man could marry a Christian woman and still identify as Jewish and not have to pick between bird and fish. He could be an amphibian, find some place in the middle. And the last question that we'll look at, do Jews born in France consider France their country? Are they bound to defend it? The love of the country is in the heart of Jews, a natural sentiment, and so powerful that a French Jew feels in England as if he is among strangers, although he may be among Jews. And the same is the case with English Jews in France. To such a degree as this feeling felt among them during the last war, French Jews were seen fighting desperately against other Jews from other countries, then at war with France. Now, was this true in 1806? Maybe that was a bit of a stretch. I mean, they'd only been emancipated for 10, 15 years at that point. Remember that Middle Ages experience of you could travel as a Jew all over the Jewish world and find, emergency rescue funds and codes of laws and business contracts and so on? Well, that reality of being more comfortable among Jews might have been the case when this was actually written. But if you think about the Jewish experience today, as we sit on the far side of the Enlightenment and in the aftermath of Napoleon's questions, if I were to travel to Algeria, let's say, I might have something in common with Algerian Jews that I would meet there. But if I met another tourist from Chicago, I might have a lot in common with them too. And in some cases more than I'd have with the Jews living in Algeria.
But more if you've met the American Jew.
Well, okay. So again, there's different levels of concentric circles that intersect our identity here. But at this time, they were arguing that the Jews were more French than Jewish, right? Again, a Frenchman in the street, a Jew in one's tent. That was the model. So here you have sort of the end of this emancipation process, the impact of Enlightenment, an aspirational statement by this assembly of notables that ultimately came true for many Jews living in Western European culture. So what we'll talk about next time is we'll turn to looking at the effects of this Enlightenment and emancipation experience on the Jews in economic affairs and social affairs. We'll talk more about the acculturation to European society and mores. And that'll be our next topic in the class. But in the meantime, I'll stop the presentation here, ask if you have any general questions before we move on to talk about our formal discussion questions.